Good evening. Thanks, Peter, Vanessa, Alex, for inviting me tonight. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. Thanks for staying late to listen to a talk. It takes a lot of motivation and passion for HTML5 and the web to be here on an evening and after work. And also, thanks a lot. Yeah, you can follow along if you have your computer around. So my name is Vincent, and this is not exactly me, but the reason, you guys know Tintin? Yeah. So two things on this picture. There's Tintin, and in the background there's a circle drawn by a computer. And the reason I have this on the screen is to tell you a little bit about myself. So when I was a kid, I was fascinated with comic books, the European comic books. You may be able to tell from my accent, I wasn't born here. I was born in France, and it's very popular. And I've always loved the quality of 2D graphics in art and comic strips. But I was not very good at drawing myself. So, tried, and it's something that's really difficult for me. And the first time I saw a computer drawn on a screen, this was like a total revelation to me. It was like, wow, I forgot how old I was. I must have been 10 or 11. I was like, wow, this is so awesome. And somewhere it got it got into my mind, but it didn't stick too much because in a sad turn of event for myself, I actually went and pursued studies into distributed computing. Not a lot to do with graphics and visual arts. I'm really happy I did this because this is what got me into the web and kind of understanding how the web works and why it's important to be architected the way it is architected. But after a while, my natural inclination got me back to working on 2D graphics. So I first worked in Java, Java 2D. And I was super passionate about it. I was, drawing everything I could. But of course, being an engineer and a geek, what I was doing is I was actually programming all the things. And on my bedside table, I had the Photoshop 4 WoW book. And what I was spending my time doing is like creating all those APIs so that I could actually recreate all those cool effects you could do in Photoshop with Java 2D. And that was a lot of fun, but very quickly I realized that this, you couldn't do much really with a little program or a Java applet that was doing a cool graphics. It was really hard to share, and it was really hard to actually get anything in. I really needed a format. You really need something to actually capture things like, if you want to draw a tree or if you want to draw a flower. A few people, I guess, can do that, just hacking past curves in Sublime Text, but I think there are few and far between. So you really need tools for that, and tools need a format. So that got me into SVG. So I got involved early on, and that was, several great years for me because the technology was really fascinating, and also I got to meet great people like Alex and the other people on the SVG working group. So, and it's been long in the making. Like Alex talked to you about, it's been since 1999 that the spec has been worked on, and it's been kind of a one-year road to actually get to today. But I think today we're in a very different world for 2D graphics. It's actually here. It's ripe. You can use it, and that's what my talk tonight is about. Is today. Finally, after all those years of having browsers, implementing this and that in the standards, you can actually finally get rid of pixels where you don't need pixels. And this is a talk I prepared with a colleague of mine called Dirk Schultz. And Dirk is also, a member of the SVG working group. He's also one of the very early implementers of SVG in WebKit originally, and so at the basis of what's in WebKit and Chrome. So we prepared that talk together. Dirk, unfortunately, is in Germany and couldn't join us tonight, so I'll represent both of us. So to talk about what I mean about beyond pixels, I'll show you a very simple website. And what you see here is a kind of a standard, one-column, page layout, and with graphics. And it's not very elaborate, but it's tiny. It's just a few K. Like Alex said, the advantage of using vector graphics is that it's one of the advantages is that it's very small. So this has a small, very, very small payload. So that page on the web would be lightning fast to load. That's not the only thing that you get when you start using vectors on the web today. If you look at it closely, you may see that the lion head is actually blinking at you once in a while. The fur is actually changing colors. It's a very subtle animation. And those icons I have here have like simple effects like this. If if I zoom in and we scroll down, you may notice that there's a little tiny storm in the cocktail. Is that so visible? All right, you can see the little wave going on, and those are the things you can get when you actually have vectors, because instead of having pixels that have no meaning to a script or to CSS, you actually have a structured graphics with rich semantics that you can manipulate just the same way you manipulate HTML elements with JavaScript and CSS. So that's what I'm here to talk about. Here on this page, it's just one example. I have those little tiny icons here with hover effects. Same thing. They're all vectors. So I think great value, ready to use, and we'll talk about that tonight. So how are we going to talk about it? So first off, I should mention that this whole presentation is actually all HTML and SVG. So a lot of the demos I'll show are actually embedded in the presentation. I'm using Reveal.js. So I'll talk a little bit about SVG. I don't know if all of you are super familiar with SVG, but I'll give a very quick introduction so that you understand the basics and how it's structured. It's actually fairly simple. Then I'll talk a little bit about the process of creating SVG image. And in my personal journey of trying to discover how to actually bring those cool 2D graphics, technology to all of us, I realized the importance of formats. The thing that followed for me naturally was to actually work on authoring tools. So I'm now working at Adobe, and I work on authoring tool, and that's what I'll talk about. Is like using those authoring tools to actually create quality SVG. And finally, I'll talk about how to bring your SVG to life. So once you've got this image, it would be a pity to just use SVG like you would use PNG. I mean, of course, it can do that for most use cases like illustrations. It doesn't do photography, of course. But it would be a pity to just use it as a static image format. It can go a lot. It can do a lot more, and I'll talk about how you can actually bring it to life. Apply styles, apply animations to it. And then finally, in terms of using it in production, I'll talk a little bit about what it takes to actually mix SVG with HTML in actual content. All right, so let's get going. So first, SVG. The SVG stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. I don't know if Alex or I said that, but it stands for Scalable Vector Graphics. And the basics is this, right? If you had a bitmap image and a vector image, and if you're in 1996 or 98 and you only need to deal with one screen, and you don't care about scripting or styling and all those things, there's not much difference. Those two things would look exactly the same. They're designed for just one screen. Now the problem is, today, the challenge we have is that the content we create actually goes into multiple environments, multiple screens, multiple DPI resolutions, and the bitmaps are very limited. For example, if I do a zoom action on a bitmap, what I get is this, right? And it's kind of unpleasant to look at. If I'm dealing with an SVG graphic, of course, because there's a definition of the curves and everything, the browser will just render it at the right resolution. I don't need to create tons of variations of the same asset to deal with multiple screen environment. So that's the core of what it means to be a vector format. Now, in terms of markup and technology, it's very much like HTML, right? In HTML, you have your tags like a div tag or a span or a paragraphs tag. In SVG, you'll find the basic elements, which are shapes. So you've got basic shapes like circle, ellipses, and then you've got your wildcard, which is a path element, which can be drawing any shape you'd like. And then you'll have, of course, text and images. And those are just elements. And on those elements, you can apply all the good things of the web, like you can apply styles to change the fill color, the stroke color, the opacity, apply filters, whatever you want. So you can control the visual aspects of those graphical objects through CSS. And of course, because it's the same core technology as HTML, you can manipulate all your elements with JavaScript as well. So it's super powerful. And this is kind of a short demo. You've got those bouncing letters. This is all done in SVG. And one of the beauties of SVG is because it retains semantic. This is actually text. So if I can select a piece of my text, or if I was doing search, etc., I can still find the semantic element of my content. So besides the advantages we talked about tonight of being resolution independent, being stylable and scriptable, there's also something about being able to actually search the text, because this is something the search engines can actually go look into and then find in your content. So that's for like the 2-minute introduction for SVG. Now let's talk a little bit about how you'd go about creating SVG images. So how many of you in the here would define yourself as designers, like web designers? All right. And how many of you actually use Photoshop? Okay, it's quite a bit of people. So one thing is, for a long time, when I was looking at, how do we actually make SVG successful, I think one of the really important things is to actually go where people are. And yes, I work for Adobe, but Photoshop is, a super popular tool, and it's really important that we can meet people where they are if you want to create the right asset. So the thing we've worked on is to actually bring SVG Export to Photoshop. And we've done that with a lot of care, I think. I mean, I'm sure there's room for improvement, but we've put a lot of efforts, and the people who worked on it know the technology really well. Dirk, actually, my co-speaker, or my virtual co-speaker, actually worked on this to get really high quality SVG out of Photoshop. So I'll show you a quick demo. That's the icon. So here, it's a standard flat design icon, except it has a few things here. I don't know if you can see that. I'll zoom in maybe in here, so that you can see a little bit of the structure. So what you'll see here is that there's a long shadow, and the shadow is black, but it has opacity and it has a multiply blend mode on it, which is very typical for a Photoshop user to do. Now you've got those blend modes in Photoshop. You can actually define to get those nice things. The reason designers use a blend mode is that if they now want to go change the background color, they'll change it to blue or yellow. If you use a black shadow with opacity and a multiply blend mode, the shadow will reapply to whatever new color you have. That's as opposed to if I define my shadow to be like a dark red. Now, if I go change my background to blue, then I have to change my shadow as well, right? So you're having those blend modes actually makes your design work much more efficient. The other thing you'll notice here is that there is a drop shadow applied on the bulb. So it's here, you can see it on the edges, and that's also defined in Photoshop. So now when you're in Photoshop, you can go to the export menu, which is something we've reworked. And if you do export as, you'll find a bunch of options here, and one of them, one of the formats you can export to now is SVG. And if you do this, it will actually export SVG with all the semantic we can retain. I mean, there are some corners of Photoshop that we can't translate to SVG, for example, 3D objects. But by and large, we've tried to carry over all the semantics of what you've authored in Photoshop and carry that over to SVG so that it can be used in production for web designers. So I prepared that ahead of time for this demo, and I integrated it into my presentation. And here, what you see is as an example of the power of you get with SVG is when I hover, I change the fill color for the background here, and I change the bulb color from yellow to white, and that's it. I didn't change the shadow. I didn't change the the long shadow here. I didn't change the drop shadow. But because this is all vector and it's all retaining the semantic of my graphic, I just need to change 2 color, and it's all going to reconstruct itself and re-render exactly. And not only that, I can animate between different states. So as I go from in and out of my image, you can see transitions between different shades of red to blue, and the same from yellow to white for the bulb. Now, if you thought about doing the equivalent of this in with bitmaps, you'd have to actually create a sequence of bitmaps, and then on hover you'll actually switch between bitmaps as fast as you can. And then if you want to do this on a 1x device, and a 2x device, and a 4x device, different aspect ratio, etc., you'd have to go crazy about the number of bitmaps you'll generate for your website. This makes it a whole lot simpler, and it's very powerful. So that's for Photoshop. Now another tool that a lot of designers use is Illustrator. So how many of you actually have used SVG Export in Illustrator? Okay, quite a bit of you. Great. How many of you are totally happy with the SVG Export in Illustrator? All right, none of you. So we heard that. And what we've done recently is actually Dirk and Dmitry Baranovsky, who's the author of Snap SVG, the popular JavaScript library, worked to actually provide another export option from Illustrator that is actually meant for production. So it's the reason a lot of people like you are not totally satisfied with the SVG support that Illustrator had was that SVG, when it was first conceived, the SVG export from Illustrator was really meant for round tripping and going in and out of Illustrator, and was really trying to achieve perfect visual fidelity. So actually getting into web production context was not really the first and foremost goal, and that's the goal we have for this new export. So short of it here is I'll go to Illustrator. This will be available soon, and if I go to Illustrator, I can have the same thing. I can have an icon. I'm not going to talk too much about the feature of Illustrator here, but you'll find the new support for SVG in the export options. And in export options, now you actually have an SVG export. So this will come in the upcoming release of Illustrator, which is imminent. But I'll get into this later, but it has a much more structured content, which makes it more suitable to web development, so that you can apply styles more easily and you can manipulate it through scripting more easily. So same thing here. It's like this little storm on a glass that I showed you in the initial demo. So what I've done in this example is I've just created the two paths, like the two states, the beginning state and the end state of that little wave effect. Baked that into my icon, and I've exported with SVG. And then I've added it to my presentation, and same thing. I have a very similar hover effect as I had before, and I've used a little bit of scripting to create the wave animation. By the way, as Alex talked about earlier, this little wave animation, if Smile was supported everywhere, I could just use Smile animation. Unfortunately, Smile is not supported in IE. So for to have this work everywhere, I use a little bit of scripting, and I'll talk more about what scripting I use here. But that's another example of something that's actually very simple and the kind of use case that I expect you might want to put in a website. So let's talk about what's new. And I've been saying it's new and better, but really, what does that mean? Why is it better? What's new in this SVG export from Photoshop and Illustrator? So there are really three components. One is the visual fidelity, the things we've done to actually really work on trying to preserve the things you've authored, or the designers you work with have authored in their document. Second thing is the structure. We've worked a lot on having a great structure in the SVG document so that it's legible and understandable by a developer. And then I'll talk a little bit about the file size, because a lot of people spend a lot of time with SVG Optimizer and trying to reduce the file size. So we'll talk a little bit about this. So, visual fidelity, this is another example. Alex actually showed, what those blend modes are earlier in his talk. So, same thing here, the same, same technology, same principle. So basically, the blend modes lets you take, the background and what you draw on top of it and define how you basically mix those colors. So, do I want to add my colors? Do I want to multiply them? There's a bunch of math operation you can do at the pixel level to explain how those two things composite. And they are visually very different. Sometimes this can be very very useful on a website. So for example, here, imagine I have a T-shirt and I'm trying to let a user pick the color of shirt they want and the logo they want to have, or the graphic they want to have on the shirt, right? Multiply is a kind of a good representation of how the ink on my T-shirt would apply. So here I have a multiply blend mode, so that the icon I have actually multiplies with the T-shirt in the background. And the power of this is that if I now change the color of my T-shirt, you see my logo just recomposites with the background T-shirt. So again, compare this to what you would have to do today if you just wanted to do this exclusively with bitmaps. You have to define, n colors, multiply that by n logos, and create, composites of or combination of the two. That's a lot of bitmaps to manage. If you leverage things like, blend modes, all of a sudden you have a much simpler task. You can just, say, I have one background image. Actually, the T-shirt, there's even only one because we apply hue rotation to actually, which is a filter effect, to change the color of the T-shirt, and then we blend the icon on top of it. And I'm really just dealing with two graphics and then a bunch of blend modes that I apply to them. So pretty powerful. So we're preserving that. Those are things that designers are very used to use in Photoshop or Illustrator because that's a tool that is in their creative palette. So now those blend modes make it out into the SVG. So powerful things because then you can manipulate through CSS and through JavaScript. Now the structure, a lot of people when they look at the SVG that comes from different tools, and I think not everybody was happy with Illustrator, but I think Illustrator is in good company in not having the perfect SVG, right? A lot of tools have exported SVG that are really suboptimal, like a lot of metadata, a lot of kind of craft in the SVG. One of the big things is the structure. The structure can be a lot simpler than it has in a lot of the authoring tools. So now we've boiled it down to the bare minimum. So that's kind of an example of an SVG output you would have, and you'll see there's no heading comment telling you it's coming from your tool of choice. There's no attributes that are not necessary. For example, we've cut out all the attributes that had their default values. It sounds silly. Again, we're in good company. If you look at a lot of the SVG that's out there, very often you'll find x equals 0, y equals 0 on a rectangle, which has no reason to be because those are the default values on a rectangle. Likewise, if you set the default color for fill to black, not needed because black is the default color. So the team spent a lot of time to actually make sure we don't have any information that's useless in the content. The other thing we're doing is preserving as much semantic as possible. So for example, if you author a gradient and you give it a name in Illustrator, you'll find that name back in your content. So if you look, if you communicate with a developer or if you're a developer yourself, you can actually, find the things you've designed very quickly. And then finally, you'll find things like rectangles or basic shapes result in your content as rectangle and basic shapes. A great example of this is here what you see at the top is a rotated rectangle with rounded corners. A lot of tools, and the Illustrator used to do this, will actually export this as a path, and sometimes with the transform baked in. And that's really unfortunate because if you're using this with CSS or with JavaScript, really you want to know that this is a rounded rect, so that then with CSS or JavaScript you can go mess around with the rounded corners radius, for example. You may want to stroke it, you may want to change the transform to rotate it. I mean, there's lots of things you may want to do. So it's really important for us to preserve the semantic of the graphics you've authored. So now we do that. That's a new export for that thing. You'll find the translation and the rotation. Again, with a syntax that's understandable. It has a translation and a rotation, not just a matrix. And then you'll find the Rx and Ry attribute, which actually control the rounded corners of the rectangle. So another example of the kind of fine details we're putting in the new SVG export. Symbols are another one. Alex talked about the use element, and it's a really powerful tool in SVG. Used to be that the authoring of a symbol could be a little convoluted. For example, if you write carefully, you would find that there was two inversions of the axis, like the y-axis would go up once and then down again to go back to where it was. So it's got, if you try to manipulate this through script, it could be pretty hairy. So now we've actually improved that export. So the symbol is as simple and understandable as we think it can be. So that's a very simple one here. At the top you see the symbol element. It's one of the elements in SVG that defines a coin. And then throughout my SVG, I can actually use the use element, which you see here on that line. And that use element just refers to that symbol definition. I can use it over and over again, which I'm doing here in this simple demo. So I can have a use element. I can actually apply CSS to it. So that's why there is a class on it. I can create many of those coins. And then I'll define my CSS. I can say, I want to have a hover effect when I go on those coins. In this case, they'll grow a little bit. I'll scale them a little bit, and then if I press down on a coin, the coin will actually flip, and I'll apply a filter as I flip. All right. So maybe a lot to take in. The takeaway here is, you can actually apply the power of CSS to your SVG very easily. So what this results in is, something where I don't even have any JavaScript. I just have a little grid here, and if I click on it, I have a filter. Except the filter does nothing by default except for the winning coin, which I have to find. So it's not here, and I suspect it's here. Yes, it is. All right. So there's a little, it's not really a real game, but it just illustrates the power of being able to apply CSS to your content that comes out of a tool like Illustrator, Photoshop, or any other tool of choice like Inkscape that may generate SVG. All right, so that's for the kind of the structure part of it. We're making the output customizable. Frankly, I would not recommend changing the defaults because they've been picked really carefully for the best usability and legibility. Now, if you have special cases, and there are times where you may want to compress it more or have different options than the default one, then you do have that option. But there's a really great set of default values. Final thing about the SVG export is the care we've put on the file size. So Alex talked about how SVG, by default, right? If you don't do anything else, usually your SVG is going to be an order of magnitude smaller than any other bitmap solution you could think of. People still like to actually optimize their SVG, and rightly so, because there's a lot of path data into SVG very often. So the path is kind of this arbitrary shape. So if you take a tree, a flower, a lot of the graphical elements besides the basic shapes will be path data, and that can be a lot of data. So what we found is that I think it's up to 80% of the content of most SVG is made of path data. So it's really important to actually pay attention to that problem. And we've put Dimitri to looked at that very problem and spent a lot of time thinking about how do we optimize the path data that we output. And what he's done is very clever. He's looked at the data and optimized the commands we use so that they retain the most semantics. So if there's an arc command in SVG, which is shorter than just using Bezier curves, he uses an arc command. If there's any technique you could think of to actually use more semantic in the path data, he used. And the result of that is our tests show that we've gained about 20% in size in the path data, and that's with preserving or even augmenting semantic in the content we're outputting. So we're pretty excited about that because for developers it means much more compact SVG with higher semantic. And that's really the last point I wanted to make, is that I think semantic trumps a lot of things as far as SVG goes, because yes, you could obfuscate and try to use minify your IDs and things like this, but that's going to be at the expense of the semantic of your file. And because the file format is already pretty small, because it's going to be gzipped when it's actually transferred over the wire, you're dealing with something that's already pretty tiny. So it seems that in a lot of use cases, especially if you're going to apply CSS or JavaScript to your content, you'd be probably better off retaining the higher semantic than applying obfuscation and additional compression on your content. All right, so that's for basically what we've done for the new SVG export, which we believe is much higher quality, how you can use it from Photoshop and Illustrator. They both share actually the same technology for the SVG export. Now let's switch gears and talk a little bit about how you actually bring your SVG to life. There is a library called Snap SVG, which Dmitry Baranovsky from our team created a couple of years ago, and there's a whole website, so snapsvg.io, and there are other libraries. Raphael, that Dmitry created as well, is another example. You could use D3 for doing a lot of work with SVG as well. I really like Snap personally because it's very, very simple to use. And I'll show you a little bit of a code sample. So that's one of the icons I showed earlier. So if I click on it, you'll see there is a few animations that are chained together to actually create the final graphic. So I'll show it to you again. If I click, we see the outline of the characters get drawn, then they fade in, then there is the bubble that grows up. All that is done with a few lines of Snap code. So first off, this is the type of content you'll get out of Photoshop now, or SVG or Illustrator. So pretty clean path data in this case. I should note here, I should have been more careful with this, that the icon was actually authored. You might ask, Vincent, you said earlier they were preserving semantic. I don't see a circle in there. What's up? So what's up here is that the author of the icon actually didn't use a circle tool. So we don't detect that it's a circle in the past. But properly done, this should have been a circle if it had been authored as a circle at authoring time. Anyway, for the scripting part, you've got your content at the top, and then with Snap, you'll do selection of your content. This is very, very similar to what you would do in any JavaScript framework that manipulates the DOM. So it's query selection basically. So I can get my hands on a little bubble. I can get my hands on the SVG, the root element. I can get my hands in people, which are the two little characters I have in my icon, and I can get my hands on the shadow. So I'm grabbing those references to those elements, and then it's just a matter of doing things like this, calls like that. So there is a very simple animate method on each of those elements, on each of those SVG elements, and what you see here. Can you guys read this, or is it? Yeah. So you can animate properties. So the way the outline gets drawn on those little characters is by just animating the stroke dash offset. The stroke dash offset is if you've got dotted lines on an outline, you define the offsets. You'll say, for example, it's 2 pixels drawn and then 5 pixel gap, and then 4 pixel drawn, 5 pixel gap, etc. So that's the stroke dash pattern that you can define. You can also define an offset which says where do you start in that pattern. So a well-known trick to actually draw the outline, like we saw, right, of the shape, is through script. You go ask the shape, how long are you? What's your total length? So if you've got like a wavy curve like this, you'll on that object you'll ask get total length. They will tell you how long it is. And then you'll say, oh, I'll do a gigantic dash pattern, which starts with a full gap, means nothing gets drawn for the full length of that shape. And then I'll do another one, which is the same length, which is drawn. And I'll set my initial offset to actually, to be 0. So when I first draw with that dash pattern, basically I don't draw it because it starts with this basically empty part of my dash pattern. And then as you go, you actually move the dash offset to be 0, which means that it's, I'm reversing it. But so the idea is that you manipulate the dash offset so you can move the stroke pattern along the path, and then it gives the effect of drawing the shape. So here, the thing to take away is the very simple animate function. You say the property you want to animate to and the value you want to animate to. You can say the length, so 1000 is a second. And then you can very easily chain animation. So at the end, you can say, and when you're done, by the way, apply this function. And here, what we do is when we're done with animating the stroke, we're animating the fill opacity to 1, so we're making the characters fade in. And we remove the stroke by having the stroke fade out. And we're doing this by animating the stroke width to 0. All right? And then we have that last for a second. And we could chain more animations as this gets done. All right? So it's pretty pedestrian piece of code here, but it's at the same time really powerful. Yes, you can. Actually, there's a great deal of using function in Snap SVG. Yes, I believe so. Yeah, you've got, but yeah, I haven't found a need myself to actually go beyond what all the ones that Dimitri has specified, but today I'm sure that you can specify your own. I don't know if there's a way to actually specify it with your own basic curves. Now, for some people, animation is tricky. If you do animation by hand, you soon realize that there's some limits to what you actually can do through coding. It's a little bit like drawing, right? Drawing you can draw a few things through code, but it's not trivial. Animation is very similar. There is a limit to the complexity of animations you can actually just choreograph through code, and sometimes a tool is handy. And a little known secret is that Flash Pro actually was completely rewritten a couple years ago, and it still has Flash in its name, but it's really a cross-platform tool. Flash Pro does WebGL output, it does Canvas 2D output, and someone on our team at Adobe actually has written an extension to do SVG output. This is CJ Gaiman. You may have seen CJ's talk. He gives, frankly, the best graphical talks I've seen on the web. He talks about WebGL and Canvas, and SVG does wonderful talks, and he's written this extension for Flash. He's talked about it at Adobe Max recently, and he's preparing an update to that extension. So I'm not going to show a demo of Flash Pro, but my point here is that for some use cases where you go beyond the simple things I'm showing here, then you need to resort to tools like Flash Pro, which have a full timeline and really higher level concepts that will help a designer really create the animation they want. All right, now I've talked about all the work we've done to actually help create better SVG so that it can be brought to life in your web design. So let's look at what that means concretely. So I'll show you a demo of SVG in Dreamweaver and see what it means to actually have that be part of HTML. So this is the website that I showed you earlier, and the things you'll see that here it's a live view. So the thing that we're running in the browser are running into the authoring tool. And now if I select an element here and finding where my insertion point is, because it's somewhere down here. All right. So if I'm in Dreamweaver now, you can see SVG treated as a first-class citizen in simple examples like if I want to insert my image, an image, now SVG is one of the formats that we support. So you can, it was not the case before, and it was not the case in a lot of tools where something as mundane as inserting an SVG image was actually not in the tool. So it made it more complicated for a lot of people to just use the content. So now it's in there, so you can insert it. The other thing you can do is actually insert content from what we call a Creative Cloud library, something I'm personally very excited about, something our teams have put a lot of effort into. And what those libraries are is this little panel you have here in Dreamweaver and in all the Adobe tools now, which are like kind of reusable assets. And what we have now in Dreamweaver is that when you want to use an Illustrator asset into your content, you can insert it, which is what I've done here. And what happens is that it will generate a linked copy of that content. And anytime the library item is actually changed, so if the designer changes the Illustrator file, the SVG that you're using will get regenerated and reinserted into your project. So I'll show you an example. So that's what I did before. I went here and I did an insert linked into my content. Now if I go back to Illustrator here and look at my here, I'll show you the libraries panel. So I'm editing this artwork once. So what I did here to create it, to have it on the screen, is I did an edit. So it opened my file, and I'll oops. I need to remember the color I need to put. So say I want to change the background color of that Illustrator file. I'll go here, change it to red, and now I have it. So I'll look at what happens to the little panel here. I'm saving this. So I've changed that, and it's changed the copy in the cloud basically. So it's it's changed my icon in the cloud. Now if I go back to Dreamweaver, Dreamweaver has noticed that the new thing has changed in the cloud. So it got the right copy. And you saw the SVG that I'm using now just got regenerated and reinserted into my project. So we're trying to be very very proactive in like regenerating assets and streamlining workflows between web developers and designers. But the the beauty of this, I think, is that you're getting your vector asset really easily. Now the way this this is done is very simple. So I'll just show you a couple code examples. If I'm here, whoops, at the very bottom, I have my my icons, and those are just inline icons. The reason I put them in line is that now they're subject to the same styles. So I have a Facebook icon and I have a Behance icon, and now if I look for the dot icon class. Right, I'm just using CSS to actually go manipulate the the colors of that of those icons. So here I have the fill color for my icons is white, and the opacity is 0.5. So if I put the same color I just put on background red, I'm not sure that's going to be a good choice, but let's try, and I'll change the opacity to 1. Oops. What did I do? Oops. Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, so you see now, so with just one simple CSS change, now I have change that propagates to all my SVG content. So it's it's very powerful. There are other things that are making SVG become a really real web citizen. Like in our tool, we have syntax completion for inline SVG. We've got the CSS, all the CSS editors and properties are supported for SVG, which is a change. And I'm very happy about this because one, in the long evolution of SVG that Alex talked about, I really think of SVG as the graphical language of the web, and I'm very happy that now in tools like Illustrator we're starting seeing it treated the same way as all the other HTML element, and especially when used inline, you've got really a lot of power. So for example, using the same colors for your divs as you would for your SVG elements. Okay, so that's it for the how you would actually bring your SVG to life. So basically, all the code samples I've shown you earlier with Snap SVG, or the little things we do with hover effect into into the icons, all that can be coded into a web a web production tool like Dreamweaver. It can be you could do all those things in things like Sublime Text, etc. Now the thing I also want to show is that I've talked about vectors, and of course we're talking a lot about vectors. The reality is a lot of websites you'll have things that are a little more sophisticated than just vectors. So this is an example of a website where I oops. I have photography, and of course I'll deal with photography, but I only have one really on that website. And everything else is semantically rich. It's vectors, it's icons, it's text, and it's all done with SVG. The one thing I haven't talked about a lot tonight, but this is an example, is creating responsive sites and SVG. There's a lot that you can discover. SVG is subject to media query. It's because it's one of the web technologies. It's also subject to media query, so you can prescribe the behavior of your SVG at different form factor. An example, a simple example of what you could do is level of detail. So if you look at the weather icon at the bottom of the screen here, you'll see that at different form factor, it actually changed the level of details that it has. So it's simpler now. It just have a few rays. whereas when it was in a bigger form, it actually had more details. So the scaling is great. It's nice for resolution independence, but you can go beyond that. And very often designers will want to do this because on a small screen, you actually the distance to the screen is different, the real estate is different than it is on a big screen. So SVG actually has all those features for you. You can actually use media query, and you can use scripting and CSS to actually deliver on those design asks. So I can go crazy and have a lot of fun with your design. So that's an example, a very simple demo we've put together of totally responsive website that uses demos. Another example is people do a lot of parallax effect. I don't know how well this comes across on the screen, but there's a very subtle animation in the back. I don't know if you. There's probably too much light to see it, but there's a kind of faded gray. So faded you can't see it now, but there's a faded gray animation in the back. Another thing this one you can see. There is the windmill is actually turning, and that's linked to the scrolling. That's a background SVG that we have here. The little wavelets are SVG as well. This is all very light, right? It's just a very light website. So that's another example. Kind of completes the kind of tools you can use. Now, there's one more thing I want to talk about, because I described I work at Adobe, and for a long time I was actually I'm into engineering, so I was managing our web products like Dreamweaver and the Edge tools and services. But I have a new job as of a few months ago of something we've been working on that I'm excited about, and it's a new project called Project Comet, and it's a new design tool. One of the things we've heard when I was working on the web segment was a lot of people were telling us, well, yeah, what you're doing is great. You could fix this and that, like the Illustrator SVG Export, but one thing we're really missing is a way for us as designers to be able to communicate our web design to our stakeholders. So either, if I'm a designer and I'm working with a developer, it's really hard for me to convey what the design should be and what the interaction model is, and we're really struggling through this. So that's a new thing we're building. It's been announced recently, and it's called Project Comet. And then I wanted to show it to you because it's a vector tool. And the reason it's a vector tool is because we think it's essential both in the tool, like when people are going to design, we know people want to design with vector asset, and also as an export mechanism. So I'll show you a short demo of this and the importance of vectors in there. So here, what we have is a design surface, and this is actually something I'm doing personally. It's a personal project. My website is totally outdated. It's a real shame. So I'm trying to revamp it, give it a nice facelift. And so I'm using the tool we're building to do this. At the top, you'll find something that's fairly traditional in websites today. I have like a first screen where oops, sorry. Should have zoomed in with the tool zoom, not the screen zoom. So I have a first screen, which is the landing page and a little navigation to the different sections, talks, design, the basically stuff I'm planning to talk about on that website. And so if I go here and say I want to have a section on designing with code and stuff I'm doing or other people are doing, I'll show you the kind of things we can do with vector assets. So if I'm going here, I can bring the the SVG badge, bring it into the tool, and it's just a simple drag and drop. So we're making it so that SVG is like a first-class element, and when we get it into the tool, we can now edit it fully. So I can go in it and then start messing around with the components. In that case, I know it's a big no-no to touch the HTML5 logo, so I won't do that. But I could, for my design, I really don't want this, this red color. So I'll just change the colors of make it black and white. So I'll make it a dark gray here. I'll change this one to be a gray as well. maybe a slightly lighter gray. I can do the last thing. One thing you may know if you've ever played with the HTML5 logo, it actually, the 5 is actually split in two. Let's say I didn't like that, and I wanted to join them. I'll just join the path. I mean, basically the kind of things you would do in a path editing tools. In my tool, I can use, and this is all the SVG I got into the tools. I can do this. And now let's say I want to do like a little list of the items of the talk. So I'll put a talk that I want to put a reference to Alex's great article about applying SVG filters to HTML, and I'll do. All right, so I can spend a little bit of time designing here and putting the fonts I want. Whoops. All right, I can type. I'll make this a little smaller. So this is like one of my items. And say I want to make a list. What I can do in our tools, you can grab it, make a repeat element, and have more elements like this. Control the the design, etc. So we brought in the vector assets, and the idea is we also want at the end of this, when you're done with your design and you've shared it with your designers, you'll also be able to get the vector assets out of the designs. You'll also be able to actually design the interaction for this. So if I've worked on this a bit. So if what you see here is a lot of wires between the screens. This is basically the navigation between the different screens that lead me to it. So now that I've designed this, I can actually go try to experiment with my site, see how it goes, and if I'm getting the design I want. So here I'm just seeing the thing I just designed. Good. While we're here, I could go back and say I want to adjust this a little bit. I would start. Whoops, got a redraw issue here. But you get the point, right? This is a tool to actually help you do web design. And what I want to leave you with is SVG is at the forefront of our thinking in working on this tool for both importing assets into the tool and exporting it. So this is it's been a long journey, but we've gone a long way. And if you remember one thing from this talk tonight is it's ready for use. I mean, really, it's a lot of people are doing it, and a lot of you, I'm sure, actually are actively using and leveraging SVG in your websites. But we know also that a lot of people are still using bitmaps for cases where SVG is a totally viable solution today. And I really encourage you to actually learn, if you haven't already, learn more about what is available, how you can use it. There's lots of great resources, like Mozilla has awesome resources about SVG. Google has a lot of resources about it. There's tons of things. There's a lot of libraries to actually manipulate SVG with JavaScript. You can play to your heart's content, combining CSS and SVG, and it's a ton of fun. I mean, it's frankly way more fun than just manipulating boxes in HTML. So don't cheat yourself. Have more fun, right? And use graphics. So thanks a lot for your attention. I'd love to hear your feedback if you have any on this talk or any questions about anything I've talked about tonight. If you don't get a chance to ask your questions now, you can always reach me or Dirk, who will help me prepare this talk. Those are our email addresses and Twitter handles. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.